Good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Wellborn. I am the Communication Chair for the Pinellas Chapter, Florida Native Plant Society. I'm standing in today for our President, Michael Coleman, who is leaving for the summer, going off to cooler temperatures. And so I, along with some other people, will be chairing meetings over the summer. Hopefully you're all members of the Native Plant Society and are aware of our mission, which is to conserve, preserve, and restore the native plants and native plant communities in Florida. So we've got lots of new members in May. I think we had 15 new members. So I want to welcome all of these folks. Allison, Victoria, Heidi, Daniel, Nicole, Janice, Annie, Rebecca, Eileen, Anna, we have another Nicole B, Ava, Anthony, Wendy, and George. Thank you so much for joining us. Great news. Our chapter has been awarded the FNPS Conservation Grant for 2021. This grant will fund a floristic survey of the Gladys Douglas property, which was acquired in Dunedin. And we'll be working with Edwin Bridges, who's a very well-known botanist on that survey. And that will be starting sometime this summer. We will be looking for what I call skilled volunteers to assist with that, people who have some good solid knowledge of native plants, who can help with identification. And then we're probably going to have just some good old hard labor to be done as well. So we'll be putting out those calls for volunteers as they're needed. But this is great news. I have a press release prepared to go out. So if you have any connections in the media, local, national, state, reach out to me and help us get the word out about this. Our conservation committee was really helpful in putting together that grant, and that committee meets once a month. So if you're passionate about conservation and want to be involved in making decisions as to our policy at the local level on different conservation issues, and also lobbying lawmakers, we encourage you to join that committee. And you can email Jane Graham, who's the chairperson, at conservation@nativeplants.org. And that's a Zoom meeting, by the way. You don't actually have to even leave your chair. We have another volunteer opportunity this week. I believe it's this Saturday. It's a native plant sale in the community of Elysium, which is a neighborhood over in Clearwater Safety Harbor area. And it's a really nice neighborhood with lots of shady oaks. So we'll be in the shade. We're going to have our exhibit set up there and giving out information, talking to people about native plants. And it'll be an opportunity for us to shop some hopefully hard to find native plants. So I need a couple people to help me with that. We've got 2 shifts, 10 to 12 and 12 to 2. So if you can come out for an hour or 2 and help out, I'd appreciate it. Just shoot me an email at volunteer@pinellasnativeplants.org. We do the twice monthly work at the Moccasin Lake Butterfly Garden, and that's involved with pruning, weeding, and occasionally planting. So that next work day is going to be Saturday, June 19th from 8 to 10 a.m. Again, if you're interested in that, just email us at volunteer@pinellasnativeplants.org. Other volunteer opportunities include the volunteer committee. We need someone to help with our newsletter and email communications. We also need people to help with conservation. I talked about that earlier. And sometimes we get requests to help organizations with doing plant installations. So we just need folks who are willing to get out there and get a little dirty. We want to have a speakers bureau, especially since we got involved with the Gladys Douglas property. We have gotten a lot of publicity. So we are getting more requests from people to speak to organizations and to schools about native plants. And this is really simple. I mean, we've got presentations already made up, PowerPoint presentations. All you need to do is just be yourself, share your love and your knowledge of native plants. You don't have to be an expert, and just, many times it's just reading the slides. So, if you're willing to help with that, let us know. We have a board of directors. They're listed here. They're listed on our website, and you can reach out to them at any time with interest in volunteering or with suggestions for activities that we can get involved in. So our presentation tonight is called Wild Design That Works. And our guest presenter is Nancy Bissett with The Natives. The Natives is a nursery that propagates and grows only native plants, including grasses, wildflowers, and rare species. Nancy Bissett is the co-owner of that nursery. She's a botanist, a restoration ecologist, and a horticulturalist. She has developed techniques for restoring upland communities, such as scrub, sandhill, and flatwoods, that include planting, direct seeding of native ground covers, and weed control. As a botanist, she has helped federal, state, and local authorities find and evaluate rare plant communities, and has found new rare plant locations, a new scrub mint, and a new Carphephorus called Pineland Purple. So maybe, I don't know whether she's going to talk about that at all, but please join me in welcoming Nancy Bissett.
It's good to see so many of you, and even just to see your names. It's so much easier to talk to an audience. One time I had to do this with nobody even listening in, and it was difficult. But slowly we're crawling out of this cold field. This talk I actually gave originally at a Florida Association of Native Nurseries symposium. And both my husband and I put it together. His work is added at the end, and I will tell you about that when we get there. And this is more about designing than it is putting together plant palettes, which would be another whole topic. Changing aesthetics. Yes, we used to actually garden with very geometric forms. And then it changed to these swirling areas, but every plant was in mass and separated. And then we sort of got into today's world. Well, yeah, we keep the curves, but we build the landscape so shortest is in front and it goes up that way. But we're in a little different era now with the changing aesthetic. I think the West is maybe a few steps ahead of us. Both of these pictures were taken from out West. And you see clumps of wildflowers interspersed with grasses, much more like what we would see in a natural ecosystem. So natural ecosystems develop over a long period of time, and they have a sense of balance, which really is hard for us to achieve in a planted system. Even in areas like this, from tall timbers, that is a pineland with wildflowers and old trees, you don't see the weed factor or disturbance in there, and it doesn't happen unless perhaps a tree falls over and opens up a fresh spot of ground, or heaven forbid, a hurricane comes through. And here from Central Florida, it looks like a dry prairie, but it was actually a flatwoods where the pines were harvested out, and you still have the cypress domes. And you see sort of repeating patterns, which is common in natural systems, with the palmetto giving some accent plants and a fair amount of color. And sometimes you see areas like this. This is a natural cutthroat seep, which is bordered by saw palmetto because that's as wet as they can grow. And it also gives the feeling of a small pond. But we have an affinity for these kind of areas, and they make us feel really good. These natural systems are so inviting and appealing because a balance has been achieved over many, many years as plants fight for their niches. And I remember reading this the first time about in Japan, they have moved houses to accommodate growing trees. I confiscated this little slide from Jarrett Daniels from the Florida Museum in Gainesville. And they're working on a project on how to incorporate urban corridors that satisfy both the need for not just native plants, but natural ecosystems, and being aesthetically pleasing to a majority of people. I find in talking with people in the past in group settings that there is a certain percentage that will never be convinced that this mumbo jumbo is actually pleasing. But here are some of the things they found out. Color supplied by flower, usually, above a critical threshold of 27%, had the highest level of aesthetic preference. But the subtle green background planting afforded a restorative effect. And this is the part I liked best. Plantings moderately or most natural in structure was perceived as significantly more restorative than the least natural in structure, suggesting people are increasingly, finally accepting of a more ecological aesthetic in urban planting. So I count this as a great move forward. So how can we do this? How can we incorporate even that kind of design? My husband and I put together this idea many, many years ago, looking at a natural scrub ecosystem, like on the left, that even has these open areas. The one on the right is a sand scrub, but it goes through a couple of ecosystem where it is down to a small lake. So we mapped an area, literally, just like a landscape plan, accounting for the tree masses to approximate size and smaller plants and so on, and even the open spaces. And it offered a sort of template on having a natural pathway through the plantings and different masses and different sizes. So here are some of the projects we have done. This is in the middle of Orlando around Baldwin Park, and Baldwin Lake is in the middle. From the lake edge or wetland area out to the path, which is highly used by the residents, we seeded it with native ground cover plants. Actually, we had planned to sort of mimic a flatwoods understory, but I did add Gaillardia. This was an in-town, and we weren't trying to actually restore a flatwoods. Here's another concept that was done by Gladding Jackson Company, which is now gone through other name changes. And it was an area around Lake Nona South where there were a series of wetlands that needed to be preserved, almost like a necklace chain of beads or pearls. And they thought we can connect those with the existing natural areas, add to it with flatwoods seeding, and have a trail that connects all of these areas, but there is a screen planted so that the homes that are adjacent will be screened, but they can pop out their back door and walk the trail. And then there are many plantings like this from Pear Park, pollinator gardens, or just simply native wildflower gardens for enjoyment. So pollinator gardens have been planted very frequently in our urban spots wherever possible. And so this is just a real short review of what they might include: the many different types of pollinators, including the bee fly, butterflies, even moths, and the family of native bees. For your review, hopefully for most of you, there are 20,000 or more worldwide species. 4,000 native bee species occur in North America, and over 316 in Florida alone. And they belong to these different bee families, mining bees, etc. Most of them actually have their habitats in the ground, so they need open spaces, or in, as in the cutter bee, perhaps even in a hollow stem. And only the last one, that contains the bumblebees and carpenter bees and native bees, will actually give you a sting. So there have been attempts to put together palettes of wildflowers, etc., that are really attractive to bees. Bee balm is really a star in this category. In fact, UF did research recently, and they used this plant to help attract pollinators and get a sense of the different species. But it's my feeling that if we plant the mix of species that belong together in a certain ecosystem, we've achieved that sort of balance. The only mitigating factor is when you're working with a small landscape, such as in your own yard, you probably have to be a little more selective. You can't represent the whole ecosystem, in other words. So whether planting or seeding, unwanted vegetation is the biggest problem. So we always start with excellent site preparation. This can be done in many ways. Here was an extreme. This was done at Nova South. They actually, because of timing involved with getting mitigation done so that a exit could be put in for the greenway, they decided to sidestep the usual site preparation techniques and actually removed the top up to 8 inches of soil. And then we had an area nearby that was being destroyed, was burned with a control burn, and the top layer of soil was actually scraped off and spread over the site. That was, and then we seeded on top. That was pretty close to a weed-free dream type of project, which is very rare. Solarization works very well for small projects. There are techniques that are well described online, so I would really recommend that you go there to get the full story, but here are some keys. Using clear plastic lets in a lot of sunlight and heat, which is killing. If you don't tightly tuck in all the edges, you lose the effect. and full sun for 6 to 8 weeks is necessary. So hitting our hot months of June, July, and August are ideal. What to do, how to get the plastic and what to do with it when it's finished also needs to be considered. What we do for very large projects, and we're talking about 10 to several hundred acres, is go through a process of excellent preparation that does involve herbiciding until the ground cover is dead. And it looks like this picture. In most cases, we need to also disc to get to the mineral soil where the seed can actually make contact with the soil. Sometimes that's not necessary, which is ideal, and make sure that the surface is seed bed ready, in other words, flat, because most of the seed that germinates is in that very top 1/2 to 1/4 to surface sown. So in some cases, we want to create an ecosystem that really would never actually occur there. And this we did at Bach Tower Gardens when they were increasing their garden area and added some examples of natural ecosystems. Creating a wet prairie on top of the big red hill is quite an experience. We did this by adding a 1 part peat to 1 part sand mixture and making it 12 inches. The bog area, which you see in here, actually had a plastic liner, but the line only went up to about within 12 inches of the surface. So when there was water that accumulated in it, it was able to leak out at a certain level. It's not an ideal way to put it. I would rather see sort of a flow through system, which we weren't able to do in this case. And I think I also would change, we put here 4 parts peat to 1 part sand. I think I would do equal parts. I think it was too much peat. We're trying to grow pitcher plants, etc. And another area was the sandhill, which was previously Bahia lawn. Now, Bach Tower did a lot of other kinds of expansion, so all of the equipment and all of the materials were stockpiled here. So every piece of equipment that comes in tends to drop weed seed, and those kind of things needed to be taken care of before we could do our planting. We were able to incorporate an irrigation system here, which has helped to establish the system. Could be used in the really dry springs, but for the most part, the system was managed without extra water. So another thing that we tried to do to make this more of a natural accumulation of plants, and we haven't gone through that long period of time where plants adjust to each other. So we're just making a jump pad to make it look like it'll work, and perhaps plants that need to pollinate each other can be fairly close. So you get a little bit of a pattern in here, a little bit. We laid out the whole area and then planted. And for planting, our company likes to use an auger. Here are the holes from the auger. It makes a very even hole, which is easy for people to tuck in the soil all the way around without having any air pockets. And another part that I gave some thought to was, what should the spacing be? At one site, we spaced at 18 inches. Here we went closer to 16 inches and 12 inches when we were close to a path so that it would look fuller right away. I don't have any final recommendations for that. I'm still thinking about what distance would be best. However, the farther apart you put them, exponentially the costs are reduced. So that is definitely consideration. And here we are doing the sandhill. One guy is augering, plants are laid out, and a couple more are planting. On the sandhill actually was connected to the existing sandhill at Bach Tower Gardens. So the area about 12 feet in from the path, we planted until we reached the natural ecosystem. And you see it here. That's Advertina jucunda in front, some of the grasses and so on. In all of the plantings for meadow and prairie, we planted 2 grasses for each wildflower. That's to give it more stability and to more look like a natural ecosystem. However, I selected that 2 for 1 just out of my head. We didn't do any sampling of natural areas to come up with this. And of course, natural areas after a burn look a little different than one that hasn't burned. We also selected a palette so that something would be blooming through every season, which isn't hard to do when you start looking at how these natural systems perform through the year. I think that was one of the more fun parts is growing all these multitude of different species for these different examples: sandhill, flatwoods, wet prairie, and bog. Here it is a few months after planting, starting to fill in nicely and blooming. And later that fall, the love grasses seem to be overwhelming the site right now. I did look at a scrub restoration site we did some years ago. I visited it this last year. And as I expected and saw in another project, over time, love grasses tend to drop out. And in the meanwhile, the wiregrass is much slower growing, expands in size and in dominance. On the wet prairie, we plant a lot of this big white top sedge. For some reason, it did not persist well. I don't know why. We also planted quite a mix of sedges like the Carphephorus species. And here's the bog surrounded by the wet prairie, fairly early. The wet prairie later in fall, oxypolis. I know I need to use more common names, but they don't spill out of my head as fast. So, and the bog, after a few months, there was quite a bit of problem getting the water in, added water and water levels correct in the bog. That's a very touchy thing. That's why I'd really recommend, if you're doing something like that, you have an inflow and outflow, even though it would be very, very gradual. So one way to larger projects and reduce costs, of course, would be to seed it. And areas, say from a half acre to a couple areas, can very easily be hand seeded with minimal equipment. In this case, we actually use and loan out the cultipacker you see in the bottom. What it does is it creates these little dibbles in the soil. The seed is hand scattered, and then we pull the cultipacker over it again to ferment into the soil. This can also be done with hand rakes and like a garden rake, and renting a lawn drum that you roll over the site. You usually fill it with water so that it has a little bit of weight. Interseeding is one thing that I tried. These plants were spaced at 16 inches, and I thought maybe we can help control the weeds by taking our hand collected seed mix, and we actually went around and in between the plants after it was planted and scattered seed from grasses and wildflowers. It was an extra step. I'm not sure if it was worth it. It's an idea I'm just throwing out there. Another thing that can be done is superseeding. In other words, seed at a much higher rate. And this will increase the density of desirable species. And I wrote and can crowd out weeds, but remember, weeds come up first. And if the weed cover is that heavy, it may prevent your more desirable plants from even germinating. This is a big problem. We've also irrigated in certain areas. Large scale is generally not practical, lack of water, etc. for the sites. We did try this at our first mitigation bank, which you see on the upper picture, and we put it in just the driest area of the site. And yes, lo and behold, we got really good germination on wiregrass, which is exceptionally difficult to get to germinate in other species. The bottom picture, we used above ground PVC pipe again that was temporary at Archbold Biological Station, and then removed it after a period of time. Again, communicating the timing of watering and so on. There was a bit of a slip up. There's always things that go wrong. You put the best plans in place, and they don't quite work out. But for the most part, I feel this is a good idea. We can pick up the PVC pipe, cut it in places that are not junctions, and use it on another site by making another junction. Irrigation for a few months really helps to establish the ecosystems, and then they need to be weaned off. In some areas, where irrigation isn't possible, we have used mulch, weed seed free, of course, which is pretty important. In this case, you can see the big bale in the back, and this baler just spread out the grass. And generally we say a cover of about 70%, so you see at least 30% open ground will give you some shading, but will allow seed to germinate, will help hold moisture, prevent wind and water erosion. And here we used it especially because we were dealing with slopes. So this is an area I think still needs more work, and the Florida Wildflower Foundation is doing research in this area, and that's weeds. Now, those of you who have heard me talk before, you're going to hear it again, because I feel this is a really important concept to understand what weeds are. Weeds are the Red Cross of the plant world. They deal with ecological emergencies. When you have new construction and the land lies fallow, the weeds move in. Ecologically speaking, a weed is a species that depends on unnatural or severe disturbances to become established by taking advantage of open space, germinating quickly, often one rain event, maturing quickly, producing seed in a short period of time, which falls back into the seed bank, that means the ground, to await the next disturbance. And this I've put in to give you some idea how much weed seed can be in a meter square. Now, this is an extreme example because it was from an agricultural area, which is constantly being disturbed, but look at those numbers. Even over 1 million seed in 1 meter square of redwood pigweed. And we will probably have much less in most circumstances, but the idea of wearing out the seed bank isn't really a viable option. You can do something about it. For example, once you prepare a site, let what weeds come up and get rid of those, but that usually isn't the end of the story, especially if you're planting. So one thing we do is use a very attractive weed to occupy that niche to some extent. Here at Nemours Children's Hospital, we used our state flower, Coreopsis, in this case, Leavenworthii, which is an annual, and therefore has those weedy characteristics. And when we seeded a whole mix of species, the first year it was a very awesome cover of golden blooms. But then after a while, when the more perennial species take hold, the Coreopsis no longer competes. It goes back into the seed bank, awaiting disturbance. And here in the upper picture, where this grate is, they had to do some additional work after we seeded. And so what came up was this massive numbers of Coreopsis instead of ugly stuff, more aggressive stuff. Another plant we've used in that way for drier soils is blanket flower. And as many of you may now be aware, we are considering blanket flower not really a native. It spread naturally, but there's evidence that it was introduced first culturally through plantings from somewhere in Texas westward. From Texas westward, southern part of the US, it's still considered native. So it's very important when you're trying to manage a new ecosystem to understand what you want and you don't. So what do the seedlings look like? Here's silver-leaved aster, and you can see the seed leaves look very different from the new leaves that look more grass-like and silvery. And the other picture, black-eyed Susan. You could do trials of your different seed and see what they look like by cordoning off a spot and labeling them or putting them in pots. You can also go to the Florida Wildflowers Seed Co-op, and on their website, they have pictures of many of the seedlings. Here's another example, Coreopsis leavenworthii. And as the seedling leaves don't look anything like a more mature leaf, and even as the leaves start to grow out, they don't have these deep indentations that a mature leaf does. And then there comes a time you need to decide, is this plant okay to leave? Why go through the effort of trying to control it? The native geranium, pictured to the left, is a winter or spring annual and usually doesn't have that great an impact. The non-native Richardia brasiliensis on the bottom, it's not just that it's non-native, it's also that it's more persistent. The good thing about it is it stays down there at ground level and doesn't compete for light, sun, space so much as some other species would do. So then we come to the problem of what do we do with the weeds that come up? Hand pulling disturbs the soil. So here you pulled it, here you've got an opening in that soil seed bank. And what will come up are more weeds. That's all it needs, is to be opened up. In fact, you can open it up just very briefly and the sunlight will trigger that response to germinate. In fact, some people have even, farmers will do their disking at night because the light doesn't trigger regermination. But there are other things that will germination in other weed species. So we do need to hand pull, and that's part of life. So my best suggestion is, when you are doing that, carry a bucket of mulch around with you. Pine straw mulch is a really good example, and cover those areas if you're doing random seeding. or recover the whole area to suppress that tendency for weeds to germinate right away. You pull one, you get 10. We used this method on another site a long time ago to prevent disturbance of the soil layer. And that was an area that had lawn, and we herbicided the lawn and planted through the dead grass. This is Gournay residence, and interesting. In preparation for our coming and planting the whole area with natives, they turned off the irrigation and had the best looking lawn in the neighborhood. That's another story. But here it is, the dead grass and planting through it. You could also do this with solarization. Planting after 1 month and planting after 5 months. And there was very little weed emergence there. So another area that causes problems is what do you do when you're planting up against a natural area? And I use this also as an example of do people really in Florida really know what natural ecosystems look like when they're just driving around? Because the edges is where all sorts of plant species, native, non-native, aggressive, etc., take hold, because there are extra nutrients, moisture, sunlight, and so on. So it doesn't look at all like the stable ecosystem you see on the inside. And how to treat that border gives some extra thought. You need to blend in to the ecosystem, keeping in mind that it does have those extra growth factors. So I said that my husband also helped prepare this, and we both gave this talk some few years ago. And if any of you are golfers, you will have an idea how pleased he was to be able to actually work at the Augusta National Golf Club. And the project is called Woodland Health. So where Augusta National was built was on an old nursery. And so there were, in what is called the rough, many exotic plants and some of them invasives. So the idea was to take one example area and get rid of the exotics, which were a number of recognized species like the ligustrum, English ivy, lily turf, nandina, even Chinese tallow. And after they were removed or treated, they were replanted with natives. Here you can see they're using a big auger for some very large plant material. So some of the techniques to consider in trying to plant something that looks like a natural ecosystem. Number one, irrigation. Overwatering leads to shallow root systems, lush tender growth, which is an easy target for insects, a weak support system, fungi, pathogens. Weeds will grow much faster. Inability to withstand drought and more susceptible to cold damage. So in this example, irrigating shallowly just for 30 minutes, 3 times a week, your water level is way up near the surface. So that's as deep as the roots go. Whereas if you irrigate only when needed and for a long period of time, then the root system will be much deeper. And if you do need to irrigate, it will be much, much less frequently. Here's an example of organic soil. Too much water and fertilizer on this pine tree that was planted in the sandy soil. And this was the result. The pine trees just didn't have the strength to stand up. Overwatering our landscapes is the biggest cause of landscape failure. Overwatering leads to unhealthy, overfed, understressed, obese plants. We want athletes, not wimps. That's my husband's humor, obviously. Those of you who know him. So pests and diseases, there are ways to treat them safely. Insecticidal soaps. The best way, however, to control pests and diseases is to have good growing conditions, which goes back to overwatering, over-fertilizing, and things like that. That is absolutely the best way. You could also use tricks like this pedal lure, which lures ladybugs and lacewings, and they will then gobble up your unwanted insects. I mentioned growing conditions. In the top picture, you have large masses of plants. Whenever you have a large mass of a plant species, it's an invitation for whatever might feed on them to multiply, grow in numbers, and attack more ferociously. So it really helps to have a very diverse landscape. And another thing is very popular in the horticultural world is to develop cultivars that are neat. They're compact. They look like they do in the pot. They never grow lanky, etc. So they breed them for tight internodes, very short spaces between the leaves. This is actually a really pretty good cultivar viburnum, but it does have those dwarf characteristics and tight internodes. So really the diversity is key to ecosystem health. Lots of different species. It can also be the key to landscape health. And now I have to interject another note. I think I can credit Jarrett Daniels with this as well. You need a certain population of any plant if you are going to successfully attract pollinators and regeneration and so on. And it's actually better to have 10 of a plant and 10 different kinds of plants than to have 90 of one kind of plant and 10 of another. So you need the diversity, but you also need a representative number of whatever you do. And so that limits the amount of species you can put into a given place. This hand pruning, I almost took that out and I thought, no, I'll wait. Because it's good to be reminded of this and just reading the red part. Take the longest limbs, hide the cut by trimming lower than surrounding shorter branches. And that gives you a more natural form. And you certainly don't have to trim on. Though we try to pick the right plant for the right place, let's face it, our spaces are small, and generally speaking, things do need to be cut back, but not like this. Plants like this don't offer much, in my opinion, in the form of beauty, but also in attractiveness to wildlife and that natural feel. So this Chickasaw plum at the FAA center near us, evidently the gardener didn't know what it was and just thought everything should be trimmed up. So it really didn't have a chance to bloom or get that beautiful form. And the blooms, of course, attract all sorts of wildlife and produce the fruit. So effects of pruning, the more you cut on top, the less you have on the bottom. And when you axe the workers, the plant stops producing. It's the leaves, the green stuff that helps the plant to grow. Again, this is information from my husband. So there are other reasons to prune or cut, and one might be to deadhead or cut back long blooming flowers so you can extend the flowering period. Not necessary, but it might add longer color to your plantings. And then at the end of the season, if you leave the stems like grasses for blue stem and so on with the tall stalks, they produce seed, and there are birds that eat those tiny, tiny seeds. So leaving some of that stuff through the winter is great, and then trim as you need to or want to get ready for spring. We also find that we think we've planned really well and chosen the right plants, but something else happens. In this case, I couldn't get the sedges to germinate very quickly. I had to get them from a natural area where we had permission to dig. And this site was beautiful. The wet prairies were just awesome. However, even in that beautiful wet prairie, there is a seed bank, and the seed bank produced the weedy andropogon, which came up way too aggressively, and we had to cut it back and kill some of them, which you can see here, so that it would not overwhelm the planting. Another site where that happened was down at Archbold. We planted some of the partridge pea, which is an annual, and I knew it would roost seed. I thought that was a good idea. But with all of the irrigation season, it weeded like crazy. So we ended up having to actually weed them out. So again, you're always looking for balance. And sometimes you think the plant is perfect for the area and it really doesn't work. On the top picture, we planted Panicum anceps, beaked panicum, because it likes shade. And the structure above should have given adequate rainfall, but it didn't like it. And instead we got some tall andropogon, so you have to try something else. Allow plants to reseed. There were only a couple of blazing stars planted here, and this is what we had the next year. And then there is the whole issue with wildflowers, and especially, which is a part of Florida ecology. And how do we maintain these wildflower grasslands or wildflower meadows that are so beautiful in our state? Give us the pitcher plant bogs and the wet, dry prairies, etc. Well, in early Florida landscapes, they planted in hammocks. The hammocks are generally free of vegetation or have very little. And so that protected them from wildfires, excuse me. If people are going to put their house in areas like this, they need to create a defensible space. And it's been suggested that there be at least a 30-foot buffer, and whatever you plant, you consider how flammable it is, and spacing the trees. Here's an example. Non-flammable ground cover, small trees. Don't put palmetto right next to the house, and keep a space between the house and the first planting. I think should be gotten away from foundation plantings, which used to be the norm. So here is an exception, the Glancy residence, which is one of the very first landscape award winners for Florida Native Plant Society. And the site was dominated by Brazilian pepper initially. Through control burns, etc., they were able to get back this beautiful piney rockland, which was the habitat. But they planted right up back to the house on what was in the area. And they actually maintained it by burning the plants near the house with a handheld propane torch, and it worked for them. We're not recommending you do this necessarily, but it's a thought I'd like to throw out. You know, I've been asked this about several sites. The one site that we worked on was in Nemours Children's Hospital, which was next to the Florida Greenway and not far from the Orlando airport. There is no way they will ever burn it. We do vote every year or two. So ending, there's a seeded and burned site that we did on a large number of acres. One is in the green swamp, one is part of a mitigation bank. And at Bach Tower in the fall, Archbold Biological Visitor Center. These are more urban. But we urge you to take this idea and take a walk on the wild side, build natural areas where people can immerse themselves in life. And I do need to give my husband credit. If you'd like to talk with us, you can call our cell phones or preferably email. It's sometimes easier to answer big questions that way.
Wonderful. We had some questions come up during your presentation, and I thought I'd just hold it till the end.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't interrupt me when I was sipping.
Yeah. You really seem to generate quite a few questions when you talked about using herbicides on the lawn, converting lawn to landscape. And Michelle Lamoth had a question about that. Michelle, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hey, sure. I wasn't expecting to actually get to personally ask me a question. Yeah, I was just curious about, you know, if you're at all concerned about the lingering effects of applying herbicides to, you know, to our vegetation, in terms of, you know, not, you know, obviously the intent with applying the herbicide is to, you know, kill the grass or weeds or what have you that are present. But then in terms of the lingering effects, you know, on the new things that are planted, as well as the beneficial insects and things that, you know, are contained within the soil, what do you say about the concerns with those kinds of issues?
Okay, yeah, I was glad you worded it that way. I think we're over the major Roundup scare. And I try to eliminate all the herbicide slides from my talks now just because of that. But there are a couple of factors. For one, the land has been abused. You're trying to put it back into a good condition. And so whether it's our larger projects where we do massive restoration, we feel like this is a one-time event. And if we use something like glyphosate, it does not appear to affect animals. However, the adjuvants can. I'm going into a little bit more detail than I usually do because there are concerns with it. But so that is one area where we are concerned. And I have also, I think, seen enough and read enough that I would be concerned about using these herbicides repeatedly on any landscape. I would definitely stay away from that.
So now, which herbicide do you recommend?
Well, it depends on what we're trying to do. For example, we've just recently used Post, P-O-A-S-T, on grasses because we can spray it over plants that are not grasses and it will kill the grasses. So that's a real selective herbicide. Glyphosate is not selective. It is drawn down from the leaves and into the roots. And so it will not just top kill, but kill down through the whole system. And there are a couple of others, but that's why I tried to stress some of the non-herbicide methods of doing things in your home landscape or even in pollinator gardens and so on. Those are small enough areas that you can usually do one of these other methods.
Pat Fling had a question. She wanted to know, after you kill the lawn, do you need to add topsoil on top of it before planting?
No, no. They just chopped right through the dead grass. And that way they weren't disturbing that seed bank that's in the soil. That was the major reason for doing that.
Yeah. Lisa Boeing, I see you had a couple questions. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Hey, Nancy, how are you?
Hello.
Nice to see you and hear you. It's been a while. I think
Yeah,
I asked
and pretty soon we'll actually be able to hug again. Yes.
I want to see you soon. At Bach Tower, do you do any burning?
That's interesting. The plans were to burn the sandhill after the first 2 years. I'm losing track of time.
I am too.
And we actually want to burn it somewhere in fairly early spring because we wanted to do some recording there. I think FAN, one of the organizations. And I was at a meeting with David Price, who's the director there at Bach Tower, and I see you're all getting ready to do the burn now. He says, what? No way. It was shut down because it was the high season for visitation. And so it got postponed, and it's a very tricky area because they have to have the wind from exactly the right direction. They have to be aware of other activities in the garden so the area can be shut off. You know, it is right outside the visitor center, more or less, and next to the children's garden. But eventually they did get it burned.
Okay, so they do it with the right conditions.
Right conditions, and they coordinate it with their adjacent sandhill as well. Yes.
Yeah, my passion now is to get my hands dirty. So I run into clients of Wilcox Nursery, and I run into pine straw. I have clients that like to use pine bark. And then how do you feel about flooring mulch, the invasive, of course my dog is barking now, the Melaleuca tree mulch?
Yeah, I think any of them can be used. Some degrade faster. I think pine straw probably degrades fastest. Using the Melaleuca mulch, that's a good way to use up those trees.
I know the Naples Botanical Garden used a lot of that. So
right, and they're close to it, so that's a factor too for not chipping. And you do want to think about, do you want garden to start moving, settling itself down, finding the best spots for plants, which involves reseeding. So at some point you want to tie that in, but I would suggest getting your garden fairly much under control before you, as far as innoxious weeds, before you start letting plants move around too much.
I think of you every time I pull a weed and think about the seed bank I'm disturbing.
There you go. All right. I wanted to get that point across.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions? I don't see any hands raised. Anybody have any other question? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up.
I have a question. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Nancy, you talked about scraping off the 4 inches or 12 inches of topsoil. where do you get the soil that's free of your seed bank that you replace it with?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, we've been able to do this at a couple of sites. And it depends, again, on economics. On that one, the most
Sure.
important thing was their timeline. And this was for future development. So in that case, the soil came off. It was one of these graders that just with a laser that picks up as much soil as you need. And they stockpiled it because it didn't matter that it had junk in it. And then the area that was to be taken by this interchange was flatwoods. So we were able to scrape it right from there.
Oh, that's
There
awesome.
have been other, yeah, and we've done this. I'm speaking for the phosphate industry. They have done this on a number of occasions when the sites were close enough. They could actually take the existing burden, level it off, and then bring tops from a really nice ecosystem and spread it out. They've even done it by using a sod cutter and picking it up that way and moving it, which is wow. For wet prairie, that's ideal. And there was one other case. It was a mitigation bank for a development actually over in the corner of Hillsborough County. It had to be done right away, the mitigation. And the funny thing is, mitigation was all done, and the shopping center was still in dispute and not built. But it was a matter of being able to scrape off that whole top layer that had torpedo grass and Bermuda grass, which extremely tough. There was no coat.
Did you go?
And in that case, we just seeded, and it turned out beautifully.
Great.
But those are rare. Those are very rare. If you can keep the seed from developing on the site, especially during construction, that's a biggie.
It definitely is. Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Nancy J. Berger had a question. He wants to know, do you think solarization is as effective as a herbicide?
It definitely can be, but you really have to follow the directions to the T. And it will also, however, kill all the flora and fauna in the soil. If you do it effectively, it'll kill the weed seed. It'll also kill the critters, the mycorrhizae, etc. So that's another factor.
All right, great. Well, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank you so much for your presentation.
Wait, I have a question, Rebecca.
Oh, well, I didn't see your hand, Jan.
I can't see how to raise my hand.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
I was wondering what Nancy's approach was with cultivars, native cultivars. When do you decide to use them and when not?
I have a talk on that. Seriously. I'd wanted to put this together, and Cammie Donaldson at PAN specifically asked me to do that too. And it's a fairly short talk, but there are a lot of negatives and a lot of positives. The good share of the positives are to please people, to have a pleasing look, to have uniformity, that sort of thing, ease of growing, more stable crop to raise, that sort of thing. But there are quite a few negatives. We have always been very conscious of having diversity within each species that we produce, genetic diversity. And we do that through growing most of our plants from seed. And some plants need to be produced by cutting, so we take them from quite a few plants. And we don't just go back to the nursery crop to get our cuttings and seed, but also go out again to gather new genetic diversity. And there's lots of reasons for that. I can't give you the whole talk. I want you to think about that. And even genetic diversity when it comes to pollinators, there's factors in there too. Some very interesting recent research.
We'll have to have you back for the talk on cultivars. So,
Okay, and I promise you it's short. It's only about half as long.
okay, all right. Well, thank you so much. You had me, I was just hanging on every word, and your photos were just amazing. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you all, sharing what we've learned, and hearing from you all whenever you have new bits of knowledge to share.
All right.
Thanks.
Looking forward to the opportunity to hug you when we see you.
All right, I'm there, ready.
All right, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Oh.